Lost in the overwhelming developments in the presidential race, including the ascension of Governor Tim Walz to a vice presidential nominee, is the looming August 13th primary. It's a primary date that will be a rematch in the 5th Congressional District and poses some unlikely scenarios in several Republican races.
Now, this is Talking Points on CBS News Minnesota.
Good evening and welcome to Talking Points. I'm Esme Murphy. It's an open secret that both the DFL and the state Republican Party really don't like this August primary because it's a time when most voters are focusing on vacations, planning a state fair visit, even starting to think about going back to school. Well, turnout in 2022 in this primary was less than 30% statewide. Tonight, we will have our political analysts, Democrat Abou Amara and Republican Amy Koch, and Humphrey School professor Larry Jacobs break down these key primaries. They include that 5th district rematch between Congresswoman Ilhan Omar and Don Samuels, a race Omar almost lost 2 years ago. And there is the unusual race for the Republican nomination for U.S. Senate between Royce White and Joe Frazier. And then there's the winner will take on Senator Amy Klobuchar in November. In the 7th Congressional District, Michelle Fischbach faces a challenge from the right in Steve Boyd. And in the 2nd Congressional District, on the Republican side, it's Taylor Rahm versus Joe Tayrab. An odd situation here. Taylor Rahm has dropped out of the race, but some Republicans are urging voters to still cast their ballots for him. We'll break it all down. Let's start with analysis from Professor Larry Jacobs. So joining us right now is Professor Larry Jacobs of the Humphrey School at the University of Minnesota. Thank you so much for joining us.
Good to be with you.
All right, let's talk the primary. It's not getting a lot of attention these days. A short time away. Want to ask your thoughts about sort of the marquee race that everybody is talking about, which of course is Congresswoman Ilhan Omar in a rematch with Don Samuels, who almost beat her 2 years ago. What's your take on that?
Well, it was very, very close 2 years ago, as you mentioned, but it doesn't appear that Don Samuels has been able to build the kind of momentum and political following that he did a few years ago. One sign of this is that some of the big donors have not stepped forward and given Don Samuels the kind of cash I think he was hoping for. You see this particularly in the case of the Jewish organizations who have been targeting, this ultra progressive group of House members, and we've seen several of them, be challenged or defeated. We have not seen that with Ilhan Omar, and I think it's because they have also come to this conclusion: not a good investment to go against Ilhan Omar, and that Don Samuels has not been able to make that kind of challenge.
I've seen Congresswoman Omar admit several times, including as recently as a few days ago, that she made a mistake 2 years ago, that she basically took it for granted. She's not going to do that again, and she's working to get out her vote. She says, I didn't work to get out the vote last time. I'm doing it this time. She also has been in the district a lot more. Whatever you think about her, you may really not be on her side or on her team. She has physically been in the district holding events for the past 2 years, much more so than she did 2 years before. That may not excuse the 2 years before, but it is a notable difference. Does that make a difference?
It's a huge difference. Ilhan Omar's got a following. She's got an organization that she's been building over the last half dozen years or more, and it wasn't really mobilized 2 years ago. Now she is a presence in the district. She's working hard, and Don Samuels has been unable to really match or exceed that. One way you see that is in terms of the DFL endorsement. Don Samuels really wanted to block that, and he was unable because of the groundswell of support around Ilhan Omar.
We don't want to appear to be overlooking Republicans here, but why is this primary in the 5th Congressional District, why is this seen as basically the ultimate decider of who goes to Congress?
The 5th Congressional District is as Democrat as anywhere in the state. And the winner of the primary will win the district. There's really no doubt about that, which is why we have so much attention on the primary between Ilhan Omar and Don Samuels.
Let's shift now to the U.S. Senate race, where obviously Senator Amy Klobuchar is a heavy favorite in the November election. She's won her general elections by huge margins. But there is a very odd situation going on the Republican side. Republicans nominated Royce White, who has a very controversial past, and Joe Frazier, the candidate who is running against him for that party endorsement, is now saying, he said originally, I'm going to abide by the endorsement. Now he's saying, I'm not. All bets are off. Just seems crazy.
The Republican primary to see who's nominated for U.S. Senate has two interesting candidates. One is Royce White, who has had an extraordinary number of really outlandish criticisms, including that he used campaign money to go to strip clubs, to go shopping. He's claimed that he's paid some of that back. Not long ago, he was a protester with Black Lives Matter, and now he's getting the endorsement of very senior Republicans and won the party's endorsement. So usually the Republican Party endorsee is a shoo-in to win the primary, except in this case because of the criticisms of White. And Joe Frazier is a guy who was a naval officer, a businessman, and he's putting up, quite a fight. He's got a uphill battle, though. The endorsement really matters in the party.
Okay, let me ask you quickly about the 7th Congressional District, where, talk about party endorsement, Steve Boyd was able to block Michelle Fischbach from getting the endorsement. Steve Boyd said in an interview, I talked to him, he said, Michelle Fischbach has been absent from the district. That's his claim. Does Michelle Fischbach have this locked up, or could this challenge actually work?
Well, I think she's quite nervous about it, and certainly feels like she deserves the endorsement and the acclamation of the party to run again. But she can't take this lightly. This is a mobilization at the grassroots level. It's part of the anti-incumbent movement that we're seeing among conservatives. I think she's got a battle on her hands, and it looks as if she's taking it that way in terms of her time and resources in winning this primary battle.
Okay, and then the 2nd Congressional District, where you've got Angie Craig running as the incumbent. On the Republican side, you had one candidate, Taylor Rahm, announce that he was dropping out to go work for former President Trump. Joe Tayrab is the one who is now the Republican endorsed candidate. But some Republicans and the local Republican Party is saying, vote for Taylor Rahm, who's not even running. What is going on there?
Well, we had, the lead candidate, Joe Tayrab, who put together a lot of money, and he had the backing of Tom Emmer and other party leaders. And looking at this, Taylor Rahm said, I'm not going to win this against the party and against all that money. And he made a decision. It's not unusual for, the party activists to kind of look back and say, hey, what happened to my candidate and fight? I don't think it's a big deal. It's strange for sure. But I think we're going to see Joe Tayrab do quite well.
All right. Well, listen, Larry Jacobs, thank you so much. Always a pleasure.
Good to be with you.
Up next, Democratic analyst Abou Amara. Joining us right now, Abou Amara, Democratic analyst. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thanks for having me, Esme.
All right. The marquee primary event is the rematch from 2 years ago of Congresswoman Ilhan Omar against former City Council member Don Samuels. How do you see that within the Democratic Party?
Well, yeah, I think it's hard to have lightning strike twice. And if you're Don Samuels, you were within striking distance last time. I think this time Congresswoman Omar's team is going to be more prepared. They're going to be spending the money, the resources necessary. And I think over the last 3 months or so, she's outspent him almost 3-1. I do think Don Samuels has a strong base of support given the war in Gaza and in Israel. But I ultimately think, it's going to be close, but it won't be as close maybe as last time.
She has, Congresswoman Ilhan Omar, in her campaign appearances, in her interviews, has sort of given a mea culpa, saying, I made a mistake. I did not galvanize. I took it for granted in 2022. I did not organize, get my people out. She's holding rallies with Bernie Sanders. She's asking for volunteers. She's working it. And she certainly has been much more in the district these past 2 years than she was the previous 2 years. It's a big difference. How much of a difference does that make, do you think?
I think that is a basically the ball game. I think that was the big difference. 2 years ago, I think Don Samuels effectively communicated to the people of the 5th Congressional District that Ilhan was focused on things elsewhere. And I think on a basic level, some people felt that. And I think we saw a recalibration with Ilhan Omar, who really started to look inward to the district, really engaging at the grassroots level, having lots of meetings and town halls and things of that sort. And so I do think she was prepared this time in a way she wasn't last time.
Right. In terms of the other primary contests, there's some really actually odd ones going on the Republican side. Senator Amy Klobuchar, of course, is running for her 4th term in the U.S. Senate. She will run against either Joe Frazier or Royce White. Joe Frazier is still on the ballot, said he would abide by the endorsement, but now he's no longer abiding by the endorsement. Royce White got the endorsement, but he's got a lot of baggage. What's going on there?
Yeah, I think it speaks to a Republican Party that's divided. So at the grassroots level, you've got Royce White, who's endorsed by Steve Bannon and other kind of far extreme right-wing folks, but he won the endorsement. And I think Joe Frazier represents kind of the Tim Pawlenty lane, if you will, of the Minnesota Republican Party. And so they're on a collision course that ultimately next week, Tuesday, is going to decide who the nominee is. Ultimately, I don't think it's going to matter that much because I think Amy Klobuchar will win, but I do think Royce White presents deeper problems for the Republican ticket, whether it be the state house or the congressional seats, because some of the things he said have been really out there, extreme stuff that I think the vast majority of Minnesotans would reject.
And he certainly also has an issue with past campaign finance issues, having listed in his campaign finance reports that he spent, I believe it was $1,200 on a strip club 2 years ago in Miami, which not even an in-district strip club. I mean, it just seems his background is just problematic, especially for Republicans.
Without question it is, and that's why they're running Joe Frazier. That's why he changed his mind. He said he was going to abide, but he didn't. And I think Republicans understand if Roy White is their candidate in November, he doesn't just present problems for the state party or a local party. This is going to be a national conversation in trying to meld the Republican brand with Royce White.
All right, how about in the 7th Congressional District, you have incumbent Michelle Fischbach. She was blocked in getting the Republican nomination by Steve Boyd, who is running to her right. He's a conservative, evangelical Christian, and who is running sort of with that front and center in his campaign. How unusual is it to get, for an incumbent not to get the nomination or be blocked from getting the nomination?
Yeah, I find this one very weird. This is not an issue where a candidate kind of tried to go to the center, if you will, and maybe left some room on their extremes. Michelle Fischbach is a through and through conservative. I mean, let's not forget MCCL, which is the pro-life advocacy group in Minnesota. She has deep affiliations with that group. She's with Trump 100% of the time. I just don't understand how much space there is to her right, but apparently there is some. And so this is one of those races to look at to show how much is Trump still in control of the party, or is Trumpism taken over the Republican Party and cannibalizing the Republican Party?
Yeah, Trump has, of course, endorsed Michelle Fischbach. From her opponent, there is the charge that she has been absent from the district, that she hasn't been at parades, that she hasn't been at town halls. That's a charge that, if true, could carry some weight.
There's no question. Folks always want to make sure you're coming home, talking to constituents, delivering results. That's true. But on the policy, one would think that on the policy itself and the endorsement of Donald Trump, that Michelle Fischbach should be far ahead of where she is. This is a race that I think national Republicans will be taking a look at because it may portend about the direction of the Republican Party moving forward.
All right. And how about the situation in the 2nd district? I think you may have described it as a shadow primary where you've got one candidate, Taylor Rahm, who actually dropped out to work for the election of former President Trump. And then you've got former prosecutor Joe Tayrab, who's running. But then you've got some Republican groups in the district saying, vote for Taylor Rahm, even though he's not running. I mean, what's with that?
Yeah, again, I think this speaks to the divide in the Minnesota Republican Party between the grassroots and kind of the more institutional Republicans. I mean, the fact that Taylor Rahm is still viable in a race that he has effectively dropped out of, I think speaks to the confusion in the Republican Party. Even though Donald Trump has endorsed Joe Tayrab, that still looks to be a competitive race. And so you have a shadow campaign of one candidate who says he's running, but the voters saying, well, we want the other guy. And
Who's
so
not running.
Who's not running. And so to me, this again speaks to that division within the Republican Party that I think ultimately helps Democrats going into November.
All right. Well, listen, Abou, Amara, thank you so much. Really appreciate your time.
Thanks for having me, Esme.
Up next, Republican analyst Amy Koch. Well, joining us right now is Republican analyst Amy Koch. Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks for having me.
All right. The marquee primary that everybody's looking at is Ilhan Omar and Don Samuels, which of course is on the Democratic side. But Republicans have some pretty unusual things going on this August primary. Let's start with the Republican race for a nomination to run against Amy Klobuchar. That just seems pretty unusual.
Right. So Royce White is the endorsed candidate. I think he will, in the end, win the primary, I think. Largely because there has not been much of a campaign mounted from anybody else, if I'm going to be honest. The endorsement was really swift for Royce White. And there had been another candidate, Frazier, who'd been in the race for a long time. Royce really showed up at the convention and just won the nomination. He's got a lot of baggage and a lot of issues, and he said some incredibly controversial, inflammatory things. And it's going to be a real problem for Republicans on the ballot. But I do think he comes through that primary.
So you think he's going to come through?
I think
because Frazier said that he would abide by the endorsement, but is now saying because of all this baggage, he's not. But he hasn't campaigned very much at all. You're absolutely right.
Even before the endorsement, I was, Royce White came on. I started hearing about Royce White jumping in 3 or 4 days before the convention. That was it.
Wow.
It was not a planned assault. So Frazier should have had the delegates wrapped up and just didn't. So that campaign's been a real problem. And
Royce White won decisely. He won on the first ballot
decisively. So that just tells me that Frazier if he can't, he has how many months of runway to the endorsement, his campaign can't pull it off. So,
all right. Well, let me ask you about Michelle Fischbach, who was blocked from the party endorsement by Steve Boyd, who is really running to her right. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, Michelle Fischbach has got a rock solid conservative record. She has represented CD7 well. I firmly believe she's going to come through that primary.
Okay, so you don't think that Republicans are not expecting Steve Boyd to?
No, something definitely to watch for primary night, but I expect that Congresswoman Fischbach will be victorious.
The one criticism I have heard about her, obviously in the 7th Congressional District as a member of Congress, is not her record or her standing with conservatives and Republicans, but her presence in the district, that she has not been at the parades, those kinds of things. Do you think that's enough? Are you hearing anything about that, or is that just a non-factor, do you think?
I haven't heard that, but, just in general, I will say, I will always say this to everyone, they need to mind their district, because when your district starts to feel that you are not paying attention, it can be problematic. I mean, we saw that Michelle Bachmann had a very high national profile and was seen as too much, right? I think that haunted Ilhan Omar in the last primary, where Don Samuels got very close because the district was feeling that Ilhan was not paying attention and minding business at home. So you definitely want to do that.
Well, let's go to the Ilhan Omar Don Samuels race, because there's no question, and Congresswoman Omar is admitting on the stand at various events that she basically made a big mistake last time for taking it for granted, that she made no effort to get out her vote, and that she almost lost. And she says, I'm not doing that again. And she's speaking at rallies with hundreds of people asking for volunteers to go door knocking. Does that make a difference?
1,000%. I think you're going to see it in the vote total. And 1,000% that makes a difference.
Those old-fashioned retail politics really make a difference. I don't know if people with social...
they want to see you. They're not interested. Like, okay, you're on a national stage and you're on a lot of national TV, but what are you doing for me? It still matters, which is great. I think that's the wonderful thing about democracy.
All right. The 2nd Congressional District has a history on the Republican side of really some odd things going on. Angie Craig is the incumbent congresswoman, and the Republican that she's supposedly running against is Joe Tayrab, a former federal prosecutor. A candidate called Taylor Rahm dropped out of the race to give it basically open up for Joe Tayrab. But now some local Republican groups are saying vote for Taylor Rahm. What is going on there?
Well, that's just a mistake. And first of all, I just want to point out that Taylor Rahm dropped out to go work for President Donald Trump, and former President Donald Trump, as his consultant in Minnesota. And the former President Donald Trump has endorsed Joe Tayrab in the race. So Taylor Rahm should, go where his boss is going, which is to say, I'm on board.
All right.
You're right. So that's what needs to happen. If the Republicans are going to have any shot, this is the only race where Republicans have a shot in November. In my opinion, we're going to hold our seats. Could be a potential pickup, but not if they're all divided.
All right. Well, it's interesting. We'll see. It certainly makes Angie Craig's life a little easier.
Oh,
you would think.
I think her statement was, she has this very simple, statement, basically, a very Minnesota statement on it, like, oh, look at that, or something.
Yeah. All right. Amy Koch, thank you so much. And that does it for this edition of Talking Points. As always, feel free to email me with comments and suggestions at esme@cbs.com. The show streams every Wednesday and Thursday night at 6:30 and 9:30 p.m. On Fridays, the show posts to YouTube for on-demand viewing. Thank you so much for watching. I'm Esme Murphy, WCCO News.